Tudors, a name synonymous with Henry VIII's dramatic marriages and 6 wives, were actually forged in the crucible of a far more fundamental question. How do you transform a fragile crown, won after a brutal civil war, into a monarchy strong enough to govern, survive, and be remembered? The story begins not with a wedding, but with a battlefield. In 1485, the Battle of Bosworth raged. England had been torn apart for decades by the Wars of the Roses, a violent struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York. These weren't just family squabbles with fancy armor, they were a profound crisis of kingship. At Bosworth, Henry Tudor faced King Richard III. Richard already wore the crown. Henry had ambition, supporters, and a claim that desperately needed a victory to become convincing. Then, the battle changed everything. Richard III was killed, and Henry Tudor won. The crown passed directly from the battlefield to the victor. Henry became King Henry VII, but winning the crown was far from securing it. That's the first lesson of Tudor history. A crown can be won in a day, but legitimacy takes years to build. Henry inherited a kingdom rife with suspicion, exhausted nobles, rival claims, and dangerous memories. His immediate problem wasn't glory, it was survival. So he began the quiet, meticulous work of royal repair. In 1486, Henry VII married Elizabeth of York. Henry came from the Lancastrian side, and Elizabeth represented the House of York. Their marriage joined the 2 rival lines that had helped tear England apart. A wedding doesn't magically heal a kingdom. Political wounds aren't cured by flowers and nervous banquets. But the marriage gave Henry something incredibly powerful, a visible story of unity. That story became the iconic Tudor rose. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York were brought together into one emblem. It told people before any speech could explain it, that division had become union, rivalry had become dynasty, and civil war had become royal order. Henry understood that power needs images. A king rules not just through commands, but also through symbols, ceremonies, stories, and repetition. He wasn't the most glamorous Tudor. He didn't marry 6 times or break with Rome or defeat the Spanish Armada. If Tudor history were a play, Henry VIII would demand the brightest costume, and Elizabeth I would know exactly where the spotlight was. Henry VII, by contrast, would probably be backstage checking the accounts. But that was his exact importance. After Civil War, England didn't need glamour, it needed stability. Henry controlled noble power, used law to discipline great families, rebuilt royal finances, and made rebellion expensive, risky, and unattractive. Money was central. A poor king is vulnerable. Account books may sound less exciting than swords, but a stable treasury gives a king crucial choices. And then there was dynasty. In 1501, Arthur Tudor, Henry's eldest son, married Catherine of Aragon, linking the Tudors to Spain. For Henry, this demonstrated that the Tudors were no longer merely survivors of an English civil war, they were now key players in European politics. But history often hides a trap inside a triumph. Arthur died young. Catherine later married Henry's second son, the future Henry VIII. That marriage, first designed to strengthen the Tudor dynasty, would eventually become the very center of a crisis that transformed England. So the first Tudor movement is this. A battlefield victory became a dynasty through marriage, money, law, and memory. A fragile crown had been repaired. Now it would become powerful. In 1509, Henry VII died, and Henry VIII became king. The father was cautious, calculating, and financially careful. The son was young, confident, magnificent, and hungry for glory. At first, Henry VIII seemed like the perfect Renaissance prince, athletic, educated, musical, charming, and eager to make England respected in Europe. But at the center of his reign stood one critical problem: succession. Henry was married to Catherine of Aragon. For years, the marriage was politically valuable and personally important, but it did not give Henry what he most wanted: a surviving, legitimate son. This wasn't simply a private disappointment. In Tudor politics, marriage, childbirth, and inheritance were matters of state. A failed succession could reopen the nightmare of civil war. So here's the key. Henry VIII wanted a son. He got a reformation. In 1527, Henry began seeking an annulment. He wanted to end his marriage to Catherine so that he could marry Anne Boleyn and secure the male heir he believed England needed. But to end the marriage, Henry required papal approval. The Pope, however, was under intense political pressure, especially because Catherine's nephew was Emperor Charles V. The matter became tangled in diplomacy, theology, law, family honor, and European power politics. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey tried to solve the problem. He failed. In Henry's court, failure near the king could be fatal to a career, even if not always immediately fatal to the body. Then came new figures. Anne Boleyn was not just a romantic distraction. Around her gathered reform-minded ideas and people who believed the English church could be reshaped. Thomas Cranmer supported the annulment. Thomas Cromwell became the architect of institutional change. Thomas More resisted the king's religious claims and eventually paid with his life. This was no longer only about one marriage. It was becoming a fundamental question of authority. Who had final power in England, the Pope or the King? In 1534, the Act of Supremacy declared Henry VIII to be the supreme head of the Church of England. The break with Rome didn't mean Henry instantly became a Protestant in the later Elizabethan sense. His motives were dynastic, political, personal, and religious all at once, but the consequences were revolutionary. The English Church was separated from papal authority. Royal supremacy became central. The king's power now reached deeply into the religious structure of the realm. Then came another transformation. From 1536 to 1540, the dissolution of the monasteries occurred. Under Thomas Cromwell's direction, monasteries across England and Wales were closed, and their vast wealth was transferred to the crown. Monasteries had been centers of prayer, charity, learning, hospitality, and local identity. Their destruction was not just an administrative reform, it was a social and cultural earthquake. For the crown, the dissolution brought immense wealth and power. For many local communities, it brought loss and disruption. Here we see the larger Tudor pattern. A dynastic problem became an institutional revolution. Henry wanted security for his dynasty. To get it, he challenged Rome, redefined royal authority, transformed the church, redistributed religious wealth, and forced his subjects to rethink conscience, obedience, and power. Jane Seymour eventually gave Henry the son he had long desired, Edward, but even that didn't solve everything. When Henry died in 1547, he left behind a son, 2 daughters, a powerful monarchy, a transformed church, and a kingdom whose religious future remained profoundly uncertain. In 1547, Edward VI became king. Edward was still a boy. Under his reign, England moved in a much more clearly Protestant direction. Worship, doctrine, church decoration, and religious practice were reshaped, but then came the old Tudor problem again: succession. Edward became ill. He was young, unmarried, and childless. Because religion and succession had become deeply connected, the question wasn't only who should rule, it was also what kind of England will survive. The legal heir after Edward should have been Mary, Henry VIII's daughter by Catherine of Aragon, but Mary was Catholic. To committed Protestants, her accession looked like a religious disaster, so a plan emerged to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne. In 1553, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen. Her reign lasted only 9 days. 9 days, shorter than many modern holidays, but long enough to reveal the crisis at the heart of Tudor politics. Jane was young, educated, Protestant, and useful to those who wanted to prevent Mary from becoming queen. But she lacked broad support. Mary acted with speed, gathered supporters, asserted her hereditary right, and became queen. Mary's reign took England in the opposite direction. Edward's government had pushed the church toward Protestant reform. Mary wanted to restore Catholicism and bring England back into communion with Rome. But restoring the past is never simple. Monastic lands had been redistributed. New religious ideas had taken root. Political elites had gained from reform. Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain intensified fears of foreign influence. In Tudor England, marriage was foreign policy wearing a wedding ring. Mary's reign became associated with religious persecution. Protestants were burned for heresy, including Thomas Cranmer. These burnings left a powerful mark on Protestant memory. Later generations would remember Mary as Bloody Mary, a label shaped by hostile Protestant writing as well as by the real violence of her reign. Mary shouldn't be reduced to a cartoon villain. She was the first queen regnant of England, ruling in a difficult political world, but her attempt at restoration created fear, resistance, and a lasting negative memory. By the late 1550s, England had been pulled in several directions within one generation. Henry broke with Rome, Edward pushed Protestant reform, and Mary tried to restore Catholicism. The result was a kingdom with powerful royal institutions but deep religious uncertainty. It was like a ship whose engine had become stronger, while the compass kept being reset.
So the second Tudor movement is this: a powerful crown turned a succession crisis into reformation, and reformation into religious instability. Now England needed not only power but settlement.
In 1558, Mary I died. Elizabeth, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, became queen. She inherited a powerful monarchy, but not a peaceful kingdom. Her problem was not simply to choose a religion. Her problem was to make a divided kingdom governable. In 1559, the Elizabethan religious settlement was established. This settlement didn't magically end religious conflict. History is rarely that polite, but it created a framework. England would be Protestant in law, separated from Rome, and centered on the monarch's authority. At the same time, Elizabeth tried to avoid extremes that might tear the kingdom apart again. The settlement wasn't a perfect solution, it was a political act of management. Elizabeth understood that ruling is not only deciding, it is staging, pacing, persuading, and sometimes refusing to say too much. Her monarchy was built not only on law, but on performance. Elizabeth ruled as a woman in a political culture that often doubted female authority. Many people assumed a woman should marry, produce heirs, and be guided by male counsel. Elizabeth turned that expectation into political theater. She presented herself as married to her kingdom. She became the Virgin Queen, not merely as a private identity, but as a public image. Her unmarried status, which could have been seen as weakness, became part of her authority. Elizabeth didn't have Instagram, but she understood image management better than many modern politicians. Portraits, progresses, speeches, ceremonies, and controlled appearances all helped create the Queen's public image. Behind that theater stood capable ministers, especially William Cecil, later Lord Burghley. Elizabeth's image mattered, but it was supported by administration, diplomacy, intelligence, and shrewd political management. The most dangerous tension came from religion and succession. Mary, Queen of Scots, embodied both. Mary was Catholic. She had a claim to the English throne. For Elizabeth, Mary was not just a cousin, she was a living alternative. In 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed. Elizabeth had hesitated for years. Executing an anointed queen was a terrifying act, yet Mary's involvement, real or perceived, in plots against Elizabeth made her survival increasingly dangerous. Her execution intensified the conflict with Catholic Europe, especially Spain.
And then came the great symbolic event of Elizabeth's reign. In 1588, the Spanish Armada. Philip II of Spain sent a great fleet against England. The crisis was military, religious, and psychological. Catholic Spain threatened Protestant England. In English memory, the Armada became the moment when a small island kingdom stood against a mighty empire. The real history was more complicated. English ships, Spanish difficulties, strategy, logistics, and weather all mattered. The defeat of the Armada wasn't caused by English courage alone. Weather even joined the Protestant cause, at least that's how the story was later remembered. But memory doesn't simply record events, it shapes them. The Armada became one of the great stories England told about itself. An island nation, Protestant, brave, threatened from abroad, protected by Providence, and led by a queen who could turn vulnerability into defiance.
Elizabeth's speech at Tilbury became central to this memory. Whether we read it as an exact transcript, a political performance, or a later legend, its meaning is clear. Elizabeth presented herself as a ruler whose body might be female, but whose authority was kingly. Elizabeth's reign didn't solve every problem. Religious division remained. The succession was unresolved until the very end. Ireland was a site of violence and conquest. The Elizabethan age wasn't a golden postcard, but Elizabeth achieved something remarkable. She made Tudor monarchy memorable. She gave England a political image powerful enough to outlive the dynasty itself. So the third Tudor movement is this. A divided kingdom became a remembered crown through settlement, performance, sea power, and national memory. How should we remember the Tudors? Don't begin with 6 wives. Begin with a fragile crown. Then follow 6 forces: money, marriage, succession, religion, performance, and sea power. Money helped Henry VII make monarchy stable. Marriage linked rival houses, formed alliances, produced heirs, and created crises. Succession haunted every Tudor ruler, from Bosworth to Elizabeth's unmarried reign. Religion transformed kingship, conscience, obedience, and national identity. Performance allowed Elizabeth to turn gender, image, speech, and ceremony into political authority. Sea power, especially after 1588, helped England imagine itself as an island nation with a providential destiny. That is the Tudor story in one movement, from roses to Reformation, from Reformation to Armada, from Armada to memory. The dynasty ended in 1603 when Elizabeth I died and the crown passed to the Stuarts, but the Tudor image did not die. The Tudors began with a battlefield and ended with a myth. A crown won in war became a monarchy repaired by money, shaken by marriage, transformed by religion, performed through image, defended at sea, and remembered as the beginning of modern England. And that is why the Tudors still hold us, not because they were simple, but because they turned insecurity into theater, crisis into power, and power into memory.
If you found this exploration of the Tudors compelling, consider sharing it with a friend.